move my fingers over there. I think I've got
Okay.
you.
I just didn't want to get started.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. As Andrea said, this is the session on the road ahead for learning analytics in higher education. And I am really, truly excited to be able to moderate this group of really extraordinary panelists. These are all folks that were on my wish list for this sort of panel, and for some reason they all said yes, and I couldn't be more delighted because I think we're going to talk about some really interesting things about where we're at right now with learning analytics, and where we see that going, because there's a lot happening in the field, and there's a lot of momentum in the field for the first time in a long time. Very briefly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Cary Brown. I'm the Director of Strategic Project Management at Unicon, which is a consulting service organization focused on education technology. And I will be, as I said, moderating the panel. I'll ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and talk just a little bit about sort of their areas of interest and focus of research or work in the field of analytics. All of them work in sort of multiple areas, and analytics are a portion of that. So I'll sort of walk us down, starting with Dr. Ochoa.
Thank you, Cary. Well, my name is Javier Ochoa. I'm Assistant Professor of Learning Analytics at New York University. My work revolves around multimodal learning analytics. That's it, trying to use several modalities, video, audio, to analyze learning processes, especially those for trying to provide feedback on 21st century skills like communication, collaboration. So I'm trying to augment the capabilities of both the teachers to provide feedback and to the students to be able to actually absorb that feedback. So learning analytics, I have been since the start of the field in 2011. So yeah, I feel like one of the researchers in the field.
Wonderful, thank you. And going down the list, Dr. Lester.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jami Lehrer, and I have a couple different titles. I'm currently the Associate Dean of Faculty Affairs and Strategic Initiatives in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at George Mason University. And I'm also a professor of higher education in that same college and university. I come to learning analytics and higher education through the lens of organizational change and leadership. And I have a book and a handful of articles and such, where the focus there was really on the adoption or lack thereof, the sort of barriers and challenges and opportunities to integrating learning analytics in the operations of a college or university, with a focus on the ethical concerns, the structural and cultural concerns of not just purchasing a tool, but really integrating those tools and their opportunities to understand students from the faculty and administrative, and even sort of the academic administrator or academic advisor, the kind of administrative perspective as well. So really excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but not least, Ashok.
Thank you, Cary, and hello, everyone. My name is Ashok Goel. I'm a professor of computer science and human-centered computing at Georgia Institute of Technology. I work mostly in artificial intelligence for education. And we are very interested in building AI infrastructure in which teachers, learners, and AI agents can all benefit from learning analytics. So as learners learn and teachers teach, and AI assistants assist both teachers and learners, can we collect data about learners and feed it to the teachers, to the learners, and to the AI assistants? I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful, thank you all. I meant to advance to that slide. That's our one and only slide. So I'm actually going to stop sharing so we can see all of your lovely faces here in better resolution. So I want to start, well, first I want to start by saying I want this to be a conversation, and it will be a conversation. We're not going to just kind of go, let's ask a question and go down the list of panelists. So I'll probably, throw questions out there. Feel free to answer, feel free to jump in, feel free to respond to your fellow panelists. And if you have questions, folks in attending, feel free to put them in the chat. Andrea and I will be looking at the chat, and we'll incorporate those, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A as well, and incorporate you into the conversation. But I wanted to start, and this will be one question where I sort of do ask everybody to, each of you, your thoughts and opinion as a baseline. I wanted to start with kind of making sure or setting that foundation of a common understanding of what we mean by learning analytics, because that is it's a bit of a buzzword actually in education right now, and people don't always mean the same thing by it. So maybe Ashok would start with you and ask, when you think about learning analytics, what do you think about? What do you mean by that phrase?
Yeah, Cary, that's a great question to start. I think timeliness is very important. But what I mean by that is that learning analytics is about taking data about learners and informing the process of learning in a timely manner. Depending on who is the person or persons who's benefiting from the learning data, whether it's the learner or the teacher or the administrator or the researcher, the time scale can vary a lot. So if it's a learner that we are talking about, then we want to make sure that he or she is benefiting almost immediately. So learners want feedback almost instantly. I have a question, I'm having a difficulty, I have a knowledge gap, I don't know what to do. And so now I want learning analytics to give me an answer immediately. If it's a teacher, then it can be timescale changes. It can be over days or weeks. I want to know how the class as a whole is doing, how an individual learner is doing, and how can I compare them. And so that's not necessarily instantaneous. If I'm an administrator, then I want the results of that learning analytics to be done over course, over the time of scale of a semester or multiple semesters. If I'm a researcher, I might be interested in longitudinal studies. So now I want to look at the data over several semesters. So the time scale varies a lot, and how we do it in a timely manner for different customers is part of, I think, learning analytics.
Okay, interesting. Jami, maybe we'll go with you.
Thank you. Yes, and I certainly want to sort of echo and ditto that particular perspective on learning analytics. I think that, there's a whole ecosystem of definitions and terminology that we, of course, don't all agree on, which is one of the joys of research and scholarly work. From my perspective, in addition to what has already been shared, I think of learning analytics really as a form of educational data mining, but that is itself focused on learners and learning outcomes. We have other forms of data mining that exist out there in the world, but this is in effect really focused on the learning outcomes, the understanding of a student's learning, and then also how that is then integrated into the processes. And so I would add to that definition, part of learning analytics is really creating platforms for intervention so that we can assist our college students or K-12 students as well in refining our learning processes and differentiating our learning processes and in improving what we do in the context of learning.
Excellent, thank you. And Javier?
Yeah, well, for me, what separates learning analytics from other fields like educational research, educational research or educational data mining is this focus on the loop, on taking data and giving back immediately to whatever the stakeholder, could be instructors, could be students, could be administrator, learning designers. But one, for me, and I think I will differ a little with Ashok here, for me, the researcher is not one of these stakeholders. Yeah, because the researchers do not have an immediate direct connection with the learning process. He can suggest things to change, but cannot change directly. That's what is important, that the data go back to those individuals that actually can change the process while it is happening. So yeah, for me, that's the main issue, is this loop of taking data, processing the data, and giving it immediately back.
let me follow up on that just a little bit. So kind of thinking about that, because, again, we think about learning analytics and the impact on, or the potential impact on students and student success and student outcomes and things of that nature. As analytics continues to gain both sort of real implementation and better implementation, what do you see as the potential impact going forward on pedagogy of learning analytics, or is there one? Is it is it something that we think might have an impact, but really maybe it won't really change things, or will it have a fundamental, potentially have a fundamental impact on actual pedagogy?
I'd be happy to jump in here and certainly want to hear from other panelists and participants who probably have lots of experience in this area. One of the challenges that we found, we did a National Science Foundation study, and one of the major challenges that we found was that it's the tools are available. There's a whole marketplace out there in the higher education enterprise and ecosystem of nonprofit, but mostly for-profit companies that provide these robust tools. We don't always know what the algorithm looks like, because they are this proprietary information, and we certainly respect that. But to get to the faculty member, there are many different barriers that are related to often just how we consult with, how we purchase tools, how we engage with those tools. And so, when we create too many degrees of separation from the ultimate, the impact that we want to take, the user, so to speak, that creates really major barriers to that information being consumed, being reflected on, which we know is a huge part of adult learning, and then also being integrated. So what we see too often is, a administrator purchases a tool, they consult with, say, academic advisors at best, but at worst, they don't consult with them at all. They then say, everybody use this tool, and faculty don't even know it exists, right? They're kind of left out of that conversation. They may hear about it, they may be told to use it, but they have no understanding of the value of it. And, teachers, faculty are craft our teaching, right? It is a craft. And in order for us to engage in that craft, we often come from a very potential philosophical perspective, right, on our pedagogy, on our teaching. We have very strong beliefs. We have to imagine that this is a learning process for the user, and that process needs to engage them from the get-go and provide opportunities for them to provide input and learning in that process. Like to use learning analytics, it has to be a process of learning, which sounds really obvious, but making that happen is a big challenge.
Yeah.
I'll stop it.
So
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump in there. I'll yield the floor to you in just a second. Just a minute. So I think the role of the teacher might be changing over time. So we can talk in terms of two different kind of information feedback loops. Typically, we talk about information feedback loop. There is a teacher, there is a learner, and there is the teacher teaches, the learner learns. We collect data about the learner, feed that back to the teacher as well as the learner. But we can also think in terms of another information feedback loop where the role of the teacher is more in the background and it's self-directed learning going on. So if it's self-directed learning going on where the learner is setting his or her own pace and place and scope of learning, in that case, the role of the teacher changes. And what I think is likely to happen, is already happening, is that we are going from an environment where teachers were central to all learning to a place where perhaps the role of the teacher is changing and the learning is becoming more and more self-directed, because learning analytics enables that change to occur.
Yeah, and I think the field as a whole is realizing that it's not so much about the technical questions about, I want a model that is 81% instead of 80% more accurate. But as Jami mentioned, it's about the intervention. It's about, we have to think on how these tools are being used and how will they change the pedagogical processes. For example, instead, what is currently the main practice in the field is participatory design, taking teachers or students in the room and say, what are your needs? What is your problem with this particular process? And let's try to figure it out how data could help you solve that issue. So I think focusing on interventions is kind of this key to actually change what is happening in the real world.
So given that, what each of you has expressed as sort of the opportunity there in kind of setting up, thinking about going forward, what in your opinion have been some of the biggest impediments to sort of a successful implementation as an industry of analytics? We've been talking about learning analytics for almost as long as I've been in the field, which is occasionally distressingly long time. And it's been this promise and this hill that we've been climbing for a long time. It feels like maybe we're cresting the hill, or at least cresting a hill right now for a number of different reasons, but it's been a slog to get to this point. What are some of the reasons we think that is, and how do we potentially see some of the changes occurring that may change that? Just throwing that out there. Anybody jump in?
Yeah, for me is there. I think there was a realization that one size doesn't fit all. That learning analytics tools are not like, okay, this is a product and I could sell this product to 20 different clients. Learning analytics are question-solving solutions. So the questions have to be the same for the tool to be the same, and that's rarely the case in education. Each instructor have different questions about their course, and that's means that the tool have to adapt to the instructor or to the student instead of the other way around. And I think slowly we're coming to that realization that, we cannot just build one tool. We need to build the tool with the stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree with Xavier. So I think this personalization or categorization or using these tools, making different kind of tools for different users and users is critically important. I think another factor has been scale. We know how to do some things well at very, very small scales, one-to-one interaction, for example. But how do you take it from that one-to-one interaction where a student or learner is engaging with with one teacher or another learner or one machine to a much larger scale has been a problem. We don't know how to do that well yet.
Okay. Jamie, I just saw you come off mute. Were you kind of?
I mean, I would just add that, we have to, I was just having this conversation earlier today, is that we have to imagine that for faculty, that data-informed decision-making is a part of what we do in some aspects of our work, but not always integrated in all aspects of our work. So helping people make that connection between, I am citing all of my references, I am, providing new evidence in the context of my research, I am, holding myself up to particular disciplinary standards, that we all know there's serious problems with student course evaluations. That is well established now. That, the idea that there are other forms of data that can inform our decision-making, our pedagogy, our teaching practice, that is, that's out there, that's robust. To Xavier's point, that perhaps even includes input from the users, I would hope it would, provides that a different opportunity. So I think there's a set of sort of arguments out there that when it comes to implementation at the university level, it's not the arguments, we're not engaging in our cultural norms and our standard set of practices in a strategic way to allow integration to be more successful. It's a we build it, they will come mentality instead of a strategic communication plan and a strategic effort. So that's all that I would add.
Well, I think it's a wonderful point, because I think for a long time, my experience, and I used to work for a large vendor in the higher education space, and for a long time, the driving factor of learning analytics adoption at institutions was essentially key stakeholders, usually at the president and board and provost levels, basically saying we need analytics, without any real clear sense of what that was. It was just they knew there was something in the air that was saying, you know, if you're doing your job, you are looking at analytics. You are using data-driven decision making was, of course, one of the big phrases at the time. And I wonder if you know, to your point, Jamie, that part of what needs to change is and Javier, I think you're saying essentially the same thing, which is, rather than a top down, it really needs to be sort of a bottom up momentum. What are rather than we need to answer some questions, it's what are the questions we need to answer, and therefore what are the data and who are the participants who need to answer those questions. I throw that out there as an observation, but I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
We talked a little bit about participatory design. I think that's a term that Javier had used earlier. And on the chat box, there are also questions of ethics and privacy that have come up.
Yes.
And I think these are all related to each other. One way of doing what you were talking about, Cary, not top-down necessarily, but involving the right stakeholders, teachers, for example. Hemi was also talking about it. We have to involve the teachers and the learners in the process, is through participatory design. And one of the advantages there is that we can sometimes point out the ethical problems and privacy issues before they occur through participatory design. There is another aspect which connects with what you are saying. Another advantage about doing participatory design or co-design, or people use different terms for that, is that sometimes the questions that we begin with change in the process of participatory design, because teachers look at it from a very different perspective than, let's say, designers of some of this infrastructure may look at. And that can really make us ask ourselves, well, what exactly are the questions we are trying to answer here, rather than going with questions that we think should be answered.
Others, any response to that?
Yeah, well, basically saying yes. Participatory design, the co-design is where the field is moving, because, for example, the question about ethics and privacy, there is these two categories of who do the analytics, who is done analytics. And the moment that stakeholders, students are involved in this process, they put that sensitivity out that I don't want my instructor to know this information. I don't want the instructor to know at what time and access the LMS. I don't feel comfortable with that. So bringing those voices into the conversation allow us to steer clear of things that, if you go, as you said, top to down, it's like, oh, we have this data, we use this data without regard of how people will feel about, even if we have the data, using it is another question. So yeah, I think learning analytics has to be some kind of grassroots movement. So teachers need to desire to have this. They need a question to need to be answered. Just that, okay, use this tool because it's there.
Yeah, yeah. I want to jump back. This is a little bit of whiplash, so apologies, but I jotted down a note about it. I wanted to jump back in particular to something, Ashok, that you had mentioned, because it's an area that we hear a lot about, and I happen to know that it's an area that you're particularly involved in, just because I know your work. So I want to start with you on this, and that is, you know, one of the things that that may be driving some of the increased focus on analytics is some of the capabilities, the corollary capabilities that are emerging in areas like AI, machine learning, natural language processing. What do each of you, and I'll start with you, Ashok, what do each of you see as either the potential or just sort of, or the concerns about those sorts of things. And again, exactly to your point, Javier, that, all of a sudden you've got all of this data, and now all of a sudden you potentially have very, very powerful technology that can be applied to that data, which not only, it raises certainly ethical concerns and privacy concerns, et cetera, but there's also a promise and an opportunity there. Ashok, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah. So three quick thoughts about AI. First, there is enormous amount of hype about AI and machine learning right now. I just want to acknowledge that right in the beginning. I mean, so yeah. AI and machine learning are not, we first have to decide what the right questions are about learning before we can offer AI and machine learning as solutions. So that's one thing, so just to be aware of hype. The second is that there are enormous concerns about AI and machine learning. Data privacy is one, but that's not the only one. There are also issues about emotional burden. So we don't want the AI to ever come to a human learner and say, I think you're lonely. The human person may be lonely, but we don't want to hear from an AI that you're lonely. So I think there are really big issues of where the boundaries lie. Having said that, both about the hype and the concerns, there is also an enormous amount of promise. And part of the promise lies in that we know from the learning sciences literature that learners need feedback promptly. Feedback delayed is learning delayed. But learners do not have access to teachers, one-on-one access to teachers all the time. It's just not possible, economically or physically possible. So that's where I think AI can really help by providing access to proxy teachers, not as good as human teachers anywhere, but just proxy teachers, parts of teachers, 24/7, anytime, any place, anyone. That's where I think AI can be really, really helpful. That's where I see the promise.
Any thoughts from the other panelists on that field? I know that's a slightly specific Ashok question, but just knowing his background and having seen that come up in some areas.
Ashok, I defer to you in your expertise. I have done no research on AI in particular, but I'll say that as a parent and watching my kids go through elementary and middle school age kids go through virtual school for, gosh, many, many, many months, they need to see humans. So my parental contribution is that these poor kids have got to make, human connections with trusting adults. So I would say integration of AI is likely, in my non-professional opinion, is there's a place for it, and there's a place that can be very valuable. And that I think often the concern is that it's not put in perspective and in context with what everything else we know about student learning and all the values of human connections. But so that's my little parental contribution.
And I will agree with you completely. So as an AI researcher, I think you're exactly right. One of the mistakes may be too strong a term, concern maybe, is that we often think of AI as human-AI interaction, and that may not be the right metaphor. A better metaphor might be along your directions, Jami, where you can say AI is an enabler for better human-human interaction. So it's the humans which are important. We want to further human-human interaction, but AI can act as an enabler there. Because human-human interaction is sometimes not possible or not very productive. Can AI then enhance its quality or its quantity? And that's where I think AI can help, still keeping human interaction as the sort of primary force.
Yeah, connecting this with the learning analytics loop, there has to be always a human in the loop. I don't trust a machine to take the human decisions at this moment. In my work, for example, I use AI as artificial perception. AI helps me, for example, see when a student is, for example, in a presentation doing something wrong, but that information is given to a human, so a human can filter that and provide feedback. So yeah, at some point I will be able to do those things, but right now they are very good for perception, for pattern recognition, and we should use it in that quality, but always with a human in the loop.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it does, excuse me, Jamie, I think you were the first one to touch on this, and obviously we've had a number of questions about it. And we've touched on it then a little bit in other areas, and that is obviously any topic like this raises very fundamental questions about ethics and the use of data. And as our gathering of data gets more expansive, and as our ability to process that data and mine that data gets more expansive, I think those concerns only become more prominent. I guess my question is very broad, which is, how do you respond to, or what are your thoughts on questions of ethics and the use of the sorts of data that's gathered in the name of learning analytics, and what are the topics, or what are the maybe the areas of focus that people should be thinking about as they consider learning analytics and the use of learning analytics at their schools?
Big problem. I'll just take a minute. Often learners do not even know how much data about them is being collected. I mean, so things have reached a point where we are collecting data without the learners, without humans necessarily knowing that we are collecting data about it. And that is a slippery slope. So I think the first thing is just to make sure that we inform learners about what data we are collecting about them. It seems to me to be grossly unfair to collect data about any human being without his or her knowledge. But I think companies are doing that now all the time, everywhere. We hear about it everywhere, and learning analytics is doing it too. But even after we collect the data, let's suppose we inform the learners or the teachers about the data we are collecting. There is an issue about who has access to it. How do we secure it? How do we maintain anonymity and privacy? And what happens if there is a leak? Who is responsible for that? I don't think that we have started grappling with these questions in a very serious manner yet. But I would begin, first of all, by making sure that people are informed about what data we are collecting, because we are collecting huge amounts of data without anyone knowing about it.
You know, it's interesting. There was some conversation some years ago at my institution where the decision was made for students would have to opt out instead of opt in. And I thought, I argued against that. But I think that's a really powerful decision. And it speaks exactly to what you just shared, Ashok, that there are some very practical ways. While they can be challenging decisions, but there are practical ways that we can inform our users of what data is being collected and give them back the agency to make those decisions. And I'll also just add that I think when we think about ethics and privacy, another framework I would overlay or include in that is the issue of equity. The early, kind of, traffic light kind of systems for students of concern had a very important assumption built into it, which was that if you were a lower income student from a particular zip code who had a particular demographic composition, that you came into the university, because certainly there wasn't a lot of data on that student, right? They're brand new. So there wasn't much collected on them. They were immediately a red light. Well, there's some reasons for that decision. We do know that our first generation students, our low income students, typically don't come in with a lot of support structures and academic knowledge of the academic system. But that's also signaling that those are the assumptions we're making about every individual. So it's important that we are very clear about equity, and I would add diversity and inclusive excellence to that as well.
I'm a proposal in my research. I'm a proposal of a radical idea of data ownership. So the data, well, there's data that belongs to the institution for their own workings, but there are other data that belongs to the student, belong to the teacher, especially data about the learning process itself. And something that I propose is the data belongs to the person that generates And below, and that ownership means that I can delete it anytime, I can take it out, I can share it if I want. So given the decision of the data to the stakeholder. Of course, this is technically difficult because it's easier just to centralize everything and everything is collected in just one place. But just because it's difficult to do, it doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. I think given the ownership to the person, especially for data that institutions don't have any business having, yeah, that should be done. Again, it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, speaking as somebody who used to be in a large vendor dealing with large data sets, those are very challenging questions at a technical level, even once you get beyond the even more challenging questions at the philosophical level of the decision making around that. I want to ask one final question of each of our panelists, and then I do want to open up the floor a little bit to some of the folks who've been asking questions in the chat, and give them a chance to join the conversation. And that is, for each of you, what do you think, from your perspective, is maybe the single most exciting development on the horizon in terms of learning analytics? It might be technical, it might be changes in philosophy and changes in pedagogy that we've been talking about. But as you look to the future of learning analytics, what to you is either the most exciting or potentially the most impactful? And maybe Javier, we'll start with you.
For me, it has to be the shift in research for, okay, this is technically possible. We're building these tools to actually trying to figure out these tools actually work, that change in a positive way the learning process. So evaluation is becoming critical in learning analytics, trying to test these tools on a large scale because experimentals are in labs have their limitations, trying to put these tools out there, measuring they have an impact, randomized control trials to say, okay, this actually benefit the students, this actually change the process. So for me, that's key right now for moving the field forward.
Excellent. Ashok, you.
Cary, can I just take 30 seconds and build on something Javier had said earlier about data ownership? So another problem that is occurring is that, without naming various corporate vendors, they now hold huge amounts of data about learners and learning, and their data is not being shared. So I think we as a society need to find ways in which data ownership is in the hands of both the people for whom the data is being collected and also in the hands of publicly shared so that we all benefit from it rather than some private company holding all the data. But now I'll connect back with the point that you were making. I think one of the most exciting changes that have occurred over the last 10 years is that in the beginning when learning analytics came and all of these issues were arising, many people were concerned about we might be that, again, ownership. Teachers wanted ownership of their classrooms, learner wanted ownership of what they're learning. Now I think there is an openness, there is a social openness to these tools and these methods. People are more willing to cooperate. They now see that these are methods of amplifying what they're already doing rather than replacing or substituting them. That's a huge win.
Jami.
Again, kind of ditto to the other panelists' comments. I think that we are, I think the societal questions that are emerging, the Facebook conversation that is in the media right now, right, which certainly cannot be ignored. But also I would, in my comments about diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence is that that also is a part of this, right? We're asking different questions societally about data, about our laws, about our social contract, about our processes, and we're engaging in conversations that are questioning how we work, right, and how we behave, and I think and what that means in the context of data. And I think that's also being promoted by the next generation of students and of faculty and of administrators who are coming at these issues from a very different perspective, right? Users of data are have grown up in a very different environment than I did, right? And they have different relationships with tools and with data. They have different expectations, they have different experiences, and they're existing in a moment where we are asking those different questions societally. And I think that this will impact how we think about even something that sometimes may seem separate, but I think is very integrated, which is learning analytics and process improvements. And we also are technically getting better, right? Our data systems are better. Our data systems are talking to each other better. The integration, Mike in the chat brought up this question around accreditation, like, why aren't our data systems talking to each other to have more robust accreditation standards, right? But those conversations are starting to I think they're happening because it's technically capable, or we're technically able to, it's cheaper, but that we're also having these larger conversations. So it's an exciting, challenging time, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I think, as you say, there's so much more that's possible. That's maybe sometimes it's a little bit hard to get our hands around. Okay, what can we be doing right now, and how do we focus some of that possibility? I do want to reach out to a couple of the folks who've been asking some questions. You could take yourselves off mute. Mike Statmore, you asked a couple of questions. I wanted to go back to the very first one you asked at the top, and that was, really interested in perspectives on analytics around curricular design and kind of curricular analytics, as opposed to what I think often think about when it comes to sort of student analytics and things of that nature. Do you want to explicate that a little bit further, and we can dig into that?
Sure. Actually, I mean, you did actually a really good job in cleaning up my language. So thank you. Just that it's there's a lot when people talk about learning analytics, there's a lot of discussion about the learner side, but very little discussion about the curriculum side. And so I'm just curious about to hear from the panel what their experience or what they see has had research that has occurred or is occurring or is being talked about. Thank you.
Yeah, I can answer that question because I actually organized a workshop on curricular analytics in the conference, the Analytics conference some years ago. There is not so much compared with learner or instructor-based analytics. But I think every year, like 2 or 3 articles deal with curricular analytics. And mainly they focus on trying to figure out bottlenecks in the curriculum. They try to figure it out, different learning designs that are better or worse than the others. Depending on your flavor, they could be, or what exactly is your question in the curricula. There could be some papers in the Learning Analytics Conference or the journal that could solve your problem. But yeah, I agree. There is not so much, at least not in the same level as the other kind of research.
Pilar, you had asked a question. I know we've got time really maybe just for this last question. You had asked a question about really how do we try to achieve some of these goals given kind of the state of the ecosystem at a technical level at this point. Do you want to ask that a little bit more, maybe coherently than I just said it?
As with Mike, you did well sort of summarizing it. Also, I think our challenge is that we don't have data analysts on our team that supports the use of technology in teaching, and we have faculty who come to us with very kindly saying, oh, I'd love to be able to answer this type of question. And our team struggles with, like, we have the data, we've been saving the data, but it's often not keyed together. I know that's probably a large reason why a lot of us are attending this larger conference sort of today in general. But it's, I've already seen a few interesting presentations in the few days already, but I'm wondering if there are, I mean, it seems like folks are building what they need, to answer the questions. And if you don't have a team that can build it, are there opportunities to, I mean, I'm sure there are opportunities to partner with companies who could, but I think our struggle is we're hearing the questions, but we don't know enough about the data, the wealth of data we have to even begin to help them answer them. So how do we start?
So
Yeah, please go ahead.
Very quickly, Cary, so you know about this, but I want to share this with Pilar and Mike. NSF has just helped set up a national institute for doing exactly what you're saying, Pilar, for bringing teachers and administrators and researchers and learners together with people who are coming from the side of data analytics, in the hope that we can learn about how to connect people up and how to collect data and share data at very large scales. So let's see what happens over the next 2 to 5 years, but there is a lot of effort going on in that direction.
And we are unfortunately out of time. I will put out a completely self-serving plug, Pilar, and that is there is another session that I'm a part of later today called Data Ready Apps that is looking at some efforts within the IMS community to try to address exactly kind of that scenario. So with that, we are a couple minutes over. So I would very much like to thank the participants here today. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm so honored to have gotten a chance to have the conversation with you, because they are all doing, as I said at the top, exceptional work in their fields and really moving the ball forward right at a time when the ball needs to be moved forward on this particular topic. So thank you very much again. Thank you to everyone who attended. This session has been recorded and it will be available after the fact on the Learning Impact website if you want to go back and review it and watch it again. And please do feel free to reach out to any of the folks at IMS if you had additional questions, and they'll get those over to us and we'll get those processed and get them out to you. But again, thank you to the panelists, thank you to participants, and I hope everyone continues to enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great morning and great afternoon.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all.
Thank
Much
you.
appreciated.
Cary, are you
Yes.
still there?
I am still
If-
here.
Oh, I froze and I could not do anything. So I'm just going to quick see if I can save the chat, which I can. Okay, great.
Okay, great. That's
So-
why I didn't drop off. Is I got your email, and I wanted to make sure you got everything you needed from your side before I left, because sometimes that'll start to shut stuff down too.
Yes, thank you. I do appreciate it. And